Good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning, wherever you are on the global time zone. And welcome to a new episode on our series, Global Religious and Secular Dynamics. My name is Jose Casanova, and I'm an emeritus professor of sociology and theology and religious studies at Georgetown University. And I'm a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, which co-sponsors this series. The series is also co-sponsored with Reset Doc, Dialogue of Civilizations USA. We are fortunate today to have with us as our conversationalist, Professor Scott Appleby, who is the Marilyn Keough Dean of Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. Scott, welcome very much to our series. We will be discussing three major topics which have been at the center of Scott Appleby's scholarly life work, namely fundamentalism, the ambivalence of the sacred, and contested modernities. But before starting our conversation, let me just go over a few of the technical details. Again, this session is being video recorded, and it will be available on YouTube in a few days, probably at the beginning of next week, at the Berkeley Center website. Those of you who are registered will receive a link to the YouTube. Again, as always, we are going to have about 45 to 50 minutes conversation between Scott Appleby and myself, and then we'll open up the session for question and answer. Please, at the bottom of your screen, look at the logo, at the symbol question and answer, and you can write down there your questions, and I will transmit these questions to Scott Appleby. We should have about 20 minutes then of general conversation. So without further ado, Scott, thank you again. Thank you very much. Please unmute yourself. Thank you so much for being with us. And let's begin with fundamentalism. It has been now over 30 years since you, and with, of course, the prominent historian of religion, a scholar of American religion, Martin Marty, started co-directing the very, very ambitious fundamentalism project, several years, 5 big volumes. It was sponsored by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It became a controversial project. Despite all the criticisms, I've always argued that the 5 volumes you co-edited remain an invaluable source for any scholar doing work on religion anywhere in the world today. Now, in retrospect, now that the controversies have quieted down, I would like you to simply evaluate, to think about what do you think are the most important contributions, perhaps the weaknesses, the strengths of the project, what remains most valuable of the project and fundamentalism, or as you call it in another briefer book that you co-wrote with some of your collaborators, a strong religion. So please, on fundamentalism, Scott.
Jose, let me begin by thanking you for inviting me to this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. I know it'll be fun. You're an old friend and colleague and mentor, and I'm just delighted to be with you. You're going to be asking me things that are so central to my career that you're going to have to shut me up. You know that. Because I've prepared some notes. So I'm ready for you to intervene as I ramble on here. So there's a lot to your question about this first topic, fundamentalism. And I'll start with some of the challenges that you mentioned in terms of the controversial nature of it, but I guess more internally, how did we deal with it as we were trying to figure this out in the very beginning? We realized from the very beginning we had a naming problem. What do we call this project? The Fundamentalism Project. I woke up every morning for those 6 or 7 years hating the term fundamentalism. But so I'm a historian by training, And big labels like fundamentalist or modernist or even modernity and tradition make historians nervous because they can cluster and conflate movements, even when those movements share what we called in the project family resemblances from Wittgenstein. There were family resemblances here, but still, these big terms can obscure the particulars, the granular texture, and the distinctive substance of the movement in question, and that's never good. Yet, when you're dealing with such a kind of sprawling topic about global religious resurgence in the late 19th, 20th century, these categories are a little bit inevitable. Some kind of clustering category seems to be both serviceable to a degree and inevitable. But so we have to ask, what are we comparing after all? That's the question. How do we figure out what we're actually talking about? And there are various suggestions made. We're talking about radical neo-traditionalisms. We're talking about anti-secularist, anti-modernist movements. Are we talking about religious nationalist movements? Every one of these terms and others as fundamentalism are misleading to a degree. They all select a particular trait and then they kind of make it stand for the whole, and they all have their problems. So we asked people, they didn't listen, and I understood, but it was kind of a quixotic request. Whenever we use the word fundamentalism, please put it in scare quotes. And no one is a fundamentalist, but we're going to use this term. So the point is, we're not on a hunt for fundamentalists, as if there's some kind of essential characteristic of a movement or a person. So the way we tried to get around this definitional and naming problem, at the very beginning of the project, when we assembled many, not all of the scholars, there were about 75 to 80 very eminent scholars who contributed to those volumes, and probably another 20, 30, 40. So, well, between 100 and 150 who were part of conversations, experts from around the world. And what we said to them in the first couple of meetings, we had 3 conferences a year and got those 5 volumes out, 3,700 printed pages in a course of 6 years. I had a full head of hair before that started. And so we said to them, this is what we said to them. We are going to provide you a stipulative definition of fundamentalism as a kind of recognizable modern religious logic or habit of mind with certain ideological and organizational and behavioral traits. But we're presenting this as one of many such options on display in the modern period in engaging religion. Modernism, liberalism, conservatism, ultra-orthodoxy. There are different overlapping religious logics and strategies for contending with modernity, if we want to put it that way. We would say today contending with modernities. Then we said modernity as if it would, remember this is 30 years ago, we're still talking about a monolith. So there are different strategies, and here's some stipulative characteristics of what we think this fundamentalist so-called logic leads us to. So we said to these authors, we're going to stipulate these traits, but we give you a big field on which to play. So now refine it, throw it out. Do not reify it. Do not fit your movement into this category as a Procrustean bed. Be faithful to the particulars of the movement or movements you're exploring in which you know best. And we also anticipated, and it turned out to be true, that some of the most helpful essays of the 75 I think we published, these are mini monographs. When I say essays, they're pretty substantial. Some of the most helpful ones break open the category of fundamentalisms and let us see a kind of modern religious topography afresh. So when they really wrestle with the term, break it, revise it, that was what we were hoping for.
Indeed, perhaps one could say that if there is any weakness, it came actually from the overgeneralization of a theory of modernity, a secular modernity. Once you begin with this presumption is when the other of secular modernity becomes fundamentalism. But if you challenge first the other theory of one single secular modernity, then of course it opens up the debate for a much, much more nuanced conversation.
Exactly. And you're anticipating, so I won't have to say it, that when we get to the part where you say, what are the takeaways? What would we have done differently today? That's number one. That at the time, we all, at least maybe not all of us, some of the forward-thinking people, you among them, Jose, Charles Taylor, many others who in the 30 years since the project have deepened our awareness of what secularism, secularity, this secular religious, done away with the binary, given us a much more complicated and nuanced view. Back then, one of the things as you just said,
right.
It was a too broad, we had a number of authors say the fundamentalists are anti-secular. Well, that was a naive rendering of it. So that's one thing that, makes the project dated, I think, in that sense, and needs updating. So I'll say the very best essays in the volumes, and there are many good ones,
No, they're excellent.
did take this advice, and I think still stand today, not all 75 of them, but a number of them as reliable sources of one of the following, and sometimes all of them. So they're still useful sources of the history and changing dynamics of these movements, the longer history, especially that first volume, Fundamentalism Observed, but throughout. And they also, the organizational ideological formations, the playing with that over time. I think the more mature statement is the Strong Religion book of that. And we also, another element of this that was tricky, Marty and I tried to urge a neutral approach to these movements and individuals and organizations, fundamentalists, even a sympathetic or empathetic approach. That was something we were trying to get across. Our slogan that is in the literature at the beginning, and Marty gave a stated address to the American Academy, and we repeated it. Our slogan is, this project is really about holding up a mirror to the secular academy. So we must be sufficiently self-reflexive to cast light on our own biases and failures of empathy and investigate why we have these biases. Now that gets lost quickly, but some of the better essays reflect on, our biases in general and our blind spots within the so-called secular academy. And yet with all these cautions and instructions, as one would expect, there were some authors who did exactly what we urged them not to do. They essentially went on a fundamentalist witch hunt, and they thought they were holding from us somehow a license to distort. Here's the movement I know, let me fit it into this Procrustean bed. That was not the, you noted there were criticisms of the project. I took the methodological criticisms quite seriously, the ideologically driven ones not so much, because we were attacked ideologically from all sides, right, which I thought was not bad. Better to be attacked across the board. Some would say you're too soft on the fundamentalists. The very first New York Book review of the first volume, Rosemary Radford Ruther, why are you being at all sympathetic or trying to understand through this thick description? If they were in charge, you wouldn't be able to publish your books, kind of thing. Then others said, including, I must say, honestly, some members of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, these distinguished scientists, Nobel laureates, not all of them had this view, but some of them said, if you don't eradicate religion through this project, not just fundamentalism, you're not doing your job. Religion is regressive, rebarbative, and so forth. So we got it from all sides.
Right.
And we had a moment of we were humbled in two senses of the word. At the end of the project, after all this toing and froing and controversy, the American Academy of Religion did award the project its annual award for excellence, analytical category, et cetera. So a big reward. And, Marty and I are sitting in the front row of a big ballroom, wherever that meeting was held, hundreds of people in the ballroom, and they're reading out the citations for this award. And I began by thinking, we have conquered, we've overcome the criticism, they get us, I'm like Sally Field when she won the Oscar or something, they love us now. But then immediately God humbled us by, when they read the citation, they identified 3 essays in the 75 that they thought were particularly exemplary. One of them that they identified was indeed outstanding. The other two were essays that we held our nose and published, which we thought were, well, we kind of need this essay, et cetera. And so here we are being honored. And we thought, I just kind of slipped out of my seat because it didn't quite work.
Well, what indicates your conversation that, in a sense, the whole debate was much larger than the project, because the category of fundamentalism took a life of its own, and within all kind of ideological debates, academic debates all over the world, taking different directions. So one has to differentiate between actually the actual contents of the project, which I always argue, for me, it was a revelation to be able to read all those things. If only Max Weber would have had all this information, he wouldn't have made some of the errors he made. The point is that it is an invaluable resource, despite the problem with the very category and the way it took a life of its own beyond the project, I would say.
Yeah, yes, thank you. You know, I'll mention one thing again to move ahead in my reflections. On that question, it did generate, I mean, not the project alone, but all the discourse about fundamentalism at the time generated large forests were felled printing books. There are, as you know, hundreds and hundreds of books, some of them very good, many of them, you know, about radical religion, religion violence, fundamentalism, etc. There is one book that just came out last year that oddly I was asked to review by a journal, and I said, you know, I'm one of the targets of this book. And I don't know if you know it, Jose, but this is a book by David Harrington Watt called Anti-Fundamentalism in Modern America. And it's an interesting book, thoughtful. It's book length, and it's basically an attack, or well, a critique of the fundamentalism project. It collects, if you want to collect all the criticisms, that's the place. Some of them I think are off target, but some of them are quite good. One of the things that he raises that's another issue for us is, with all this attention to fundamentalism to the project, which the Academy, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, first promoted as kind of a policy study. Well, what is the role, you know, of a study of religions around the world? What does this have to do with policy? And are you instrumentalizing religion? And are you picking out the good guys from the bad guys in religion? And what really helpfully summarizes a lot of the criticisms or concerns there. I think at times he goes a little bit too far in exaggerating. It's an open question. The influence of academics, even a big study like this, in that he said he refers to a little 5-page article that Marty wrote for the Saturday Review before the project, long before the project, about fundamentalism, and this is in the context of the Iranian Revolution. And he kind of makes the claim, Watt does, that and everything else drove US policy toward Iran. Well, that's a pretty big claim. I hope it's not true, but it's a real issue. The other thing that he says, worth mentioning, and the book is really interesting if you care about this topic. The category of fundamentalism, he says the practice is objectionable because, quote, the fundamentalist, non-fundamentalist binary reinforces our tendency to divide the world into heroes and villains. And I think that's a fair caution and concern. We tried to avoid it. You know, let me mention one other thing. One of the things I learned, or one of the challenges was, how do you take a sympathetic or empathetic approach to people who's you're kind of describing in a way as aggressive, militant, exclusive, et cetera. And also there are some in the fundamentalist category, whether ours or someone else's, that are very violent and that that do violence and kill people. You know, Al-Qaeda would kind of qualify in a way as that kind of group, but there are many others who've done violence, and violence against innocents, against non-combatants. So I remember at one point, a good dear friend, a historian of evangelicalism, in one of our exchanges during the project, pounded his otherwise peaceful fist on the table and said, "We do not carry guns in the basement of Moody Bible School." how can you compare us to the Iranians?
Wow, yes, yes.
And then on the other hand, we in one of our deliberative meetings with some scholars, I was suggesting we're going to reach out and try to have some of these folks who, you know, we would describe as fundamentalists or think they should write for us. They should not have us speak for them. And one of the scholars around the table looked at me with disdain, you naive little white boy kind of look, because the people I study, Sinhala Buddhist extremists, would have you for breakfast. They're not going to come sit in your academic circles and write that you don't understand, man, what you're really talking about in terms of these people. So it's very uncomfortable for me to cluster actors who are not violent, but whose rhetoric may be quite aggressive and militant, with those who are clearly dedicated to lethal violence, and to have one category or even subcategories, that it's a challenge. Some people who, when we raised this as an objection, a number of people said, maybe unfairly, well, the reason that you have some movements that are not doing deadly violence in 1995, remember we're talking, some of these people, because they live in societies like the United States where there's a strong rule of law and they get prosecuted and they don't have the means. If they didn't, if they lived in a weak state, they'd be just as violent as those that, you know, what do you do with that comment? So anyway, that was a perplexing piece of this.
I mean, I think that I personally would argue that the most, of course, problematic aspect, as you point out, is the very binary distinction that presupposes there is something else which is the normative process, and the fundamentalism is what is not normative.
Exactly.
And it's this presupposition which is very difficult to get away with. I mean, for me as a sociologist, it was striking to see how Talcott Parsons first took the category of fundamentalism from religion to use it to modernizing processes, and called the Nazi proto-modernization fundamentalists and the Soviet fundamentalists. So as opposed to the liberal modernization, then you have fundamentalist models of modernization, the Nazis and the Soviet. So again, it presupposes a normative model of a telos in history, and then what is the counter. But of course, this in itself shows the difficulties precisely of the category. I let you basically say if the final word about the fundamentalism project, and we'll move on to the next topic.
Okay, just a quick anecdote about your point you just made. Very early on, I was 30 years old, and I was, you know, still wet behind the ears, and I was in, Marty couldn't make this, and we were rolling out this project to this very distinguished group of scientists at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Again, people who worked on the Manhattan Project, and in doing that, we had some materials about what we would be doing over the years, and we had one paragraph in a 8-page single-spaced newsletter that one day we might explore the idea of secular or scientific fundamentalisms, by which we meant a kind of exclusivist, dogmatic, absolutist worldview that doesn't allow for, you know, and it was like hitting a baseball bat with hornet's nest. They somehow found that paragraph. They said, what do you mean, young man? You know, you're in shallow water, but you're drowning. We scientists are not fundamentalists. And then other scientists in the room said, wait a second, what about this and that? And so there was a very interesting conversation. Let me conclude this on the Fundamentalism Project by mentioning just one other thing. We mentioned what are the takeaways? You mentioned already, Jose, the need for a more refined view of secularism. That's something that marred the project. But I want to say there's some of the things I'm proudest of about the project are some of the individual essays, and I will give you a 20-second commercial for those people who don't know the project. There are some gems in that series that still give me goosebumps when I read them, that are just, they did what we were hoping for. They took this clunky fundamentalism concept and they put it aside, or they reacted to it, but in their own terms, they said, how is what they're talking about apply to this community I know? So a really brilliant gem is an essay by Chaim Soloveitchik on migration, assimilation, and the new role of text in the Haredi world. If you read no other essay, and they're all very good, that's a gem that you could assign in a graduate seminar to this day about, as he talked about the change of Jewish identity as he was growing up in this important rabbinic family, and the shift from mimesis to performance, and kind of now needing to perform according to the new layer of text, and rather than kind of learn organically from a mimetic tradition in the home what it meant to be Jewish in the modern world. Anyway, there are several other, I'll mention the names and I'll stop. Aziz Sachedina on Shiism, a brilliant a brilliant essay by Emmanuel Savan called The Enclave Culture, which works in several languages to compare this notion of being an exile in enclave that doesn't just apply to religious groups, but can be applied more broadly. Brilliant. That's in the Strong Religion book.
It's the category of, but it's the traditional category of sect to a certain extent.
Yes. That Strong Religion book is a better term for us because it gets away from the some of the fundamentalism stuff. And the Strong
you
Religion
almost also restricted to almost the monotheistic traditions.
Yes, exactly. Make it easier. And the strong there just means a heavier dose of religious awareness in the movement. That's strong in that sense, not necessarily the other sense. Anyway, Harjat Oberoi on the construction and maintenance of boundaries and Sikhism, Mumtaz Ahmad on the Pakistan and the Jamaat-e-Islami, Nancy Ammerman on Christian fundamentalism, and finally I'll mention Sam Heilman and Menachem Friedman on the Haredi, the really interesting. So anyway, though there's some gems there worth doing.
I concur with that. I learn a lot reading it, despite all my ambivalence. And let's talk about the ambivalence of the concept of fundamentalism. And let's move to the ambivalence of the sacred. This was the title of a very important book you wrote. I think it was 1999. It was before, obviously, September 11, and yet very clearly you point out precisely this ambivalence of the sacred that has the power both to sacralize violence, but also to desacralize violence, and therefore a source for peacemaking. So I want you to basically, how do you move from precisely the ambivalence of, or studying a strong religion, to this notion of the ambivalence of the sacred, which of course is a fundamental category in the phenomenology of religion always, right? This notion of being something terrible and something at the same time attractive. And so this duality of the sacred, positive and negative. So please, just tell us what do you mean by the ambivalence of the sacred,
thank you,
and how it is related to the question of sacred violence and peacemaking.
Thank you, Jose. I begin by saying that, you know, you've done this in your own work, and that is you keep working through problems that you start with, and you keep revisiting them, and hopefully kind of maturing in your way of thinking about them. So the ambivalence was in part, I used to joke that it was my penance for the Fundamentalism Project, in that I focused so many years on the so-called bad actors. Now let's see how religion fosters human rights and cooperation and peacemaking. Of course, it's more complicated than that. I was also trying to avoid, in the ambivalence book, or directly address this problem of binaries. You know, how do you avoid the fundamentalist, non-fundamentalist, or and so used a spectrum. The kind of key insight for the book is there is a spectrum when we ask the question about religious actors in the modern world or in the contemporary world. I posited that religious actors, Charles Liebman wrote an article many years ago, late political scientist, on extremism as a religious norm. And his claim was that to be fully religious is to be an extremist. Now, I changed that word extremism. I used my own language, but beginning by positing that the religious actors we're really interested in here, there are other religious actors, and these religious actors might say those people are lukewarm. We're the ones who are militant in the sense of not necessarily physically violent, spiritually militant. That is, we are self-sacrificing. We prioritize our faith, however that's described, above all else, including our families, including our loved ones, if we have to make that choice. We are militantly devoted to fill in the blank within the canopy of the sacred. So that's a little different than a binaries. You're the good guys, you're the bad guys. The question becomes there, the question is about violence. All of these groups, very few of them, you're not gonna find any of them that don't say, I'm working for justice. I'm working for human dignity. You know, it's not like just the people we like are saying that. I never would have said it, but I listened to bin Laden in the cave the same day that Bush, October 7th, 2001, you mentioned that. And, you know, part of what he said was a social justice critique of the United States that I couldn't argue with. I mean, I don't endorse anything, but so anyway, the question then becomes, okay, bin Laden, but let's talk about violence against innocents. How is this justified? So anyway, the book draws a spectrum at one extreme, one end of it, who believe the focus is on that if necessary, one does violence, or some movements that even say it's our duty to not only do violence against the enemy, the satanic enemy or whatever, but in fact to eliminate that person, to annihilate that movement. And then on the other side, as you read the literature and you learn more about these movements, on the peacemaking side, there are actors who, even Gandhi himself, who are not absolute pacifists, but they work hard to restrict the uses of violence, to condition it, and with the goal of not eliminating their enemies, but countering them. So it seems to me, though, you know, that's a reliable to the self-descriptions of what these leaders of these, so that was the first thing about the book. Trying to kind of break down binaries and ask, what do people think they're doing in their agency in the world to achieve justice as they understand it? And what's the role of violence against others in that logic? So then two other kind of bigger comments or overall comments. What I was hoping for, and the book has, you know, it was reviewed, but it wasn't reviewed as widely as I would have liked, but it continues to be a reference point, which I'm very gratified by. And what I was trying to do is challenge partly in the book, again, pardon me for using the word secularist, just as shorthand, but secularists are sometimes governmental. This is back to Watt's critique of the public. You know, what are we doing as scholars of religion in the public sphere? And especially in policy and in government. So I was trying to highlight that religion is not just evanescent or marginal or it's not just a dependent variable, it can be an independent variable. It can be a cause in a way, that's a complicated word, not just a dependent variable. I never forget, being at your university, your distinguished university, for one of the many great talks, this is years ago, not long after the Iranian Islamic Revolution in Iran, a former US ambassador to Egypt got up, he was talking about the Iranian situation. He said, you know, this is kind of in the midst of it, this is just an economic and class rebellion sugar-coated with religious pieties. And you know, there's just a deep secular myopia there that doesn't take religion as a kind of its own dynamic, its own force. So the Ambivalence book was, among many other books, not only it, is that religion is also a cause rather than only an effect that can be theorized away as something not real. Martin Marty used to say, don't take the nothing buttery approach to religion, meaning it's nothing but politics, economics, etc. That's not the way to say, it's not nothing buttery. So superficially, you know, or that was a goal. The challenge was, if the book is read, I think superficially, it could be read as, okay, let's operationalize this thing, that this ambivalence and the causes for violence and causes for peacemaking, and turn it into a myriad of policies for so-called global engagement with religion. And that the book was, I was invited to address this. How can your book be turned into a way to operationalize the containment of bad religion through a security apparatus, or harnessing good religion through investment in development and peace building programs and so on? I mean, to a degree, I accept this reading. There are implications for this spectrum of violence and less violence or nonviolence. And yes, do we want to look kindly upon and support in some way those movements that are courageous and that they're peace builders, and there are many of them, or civil rights, who are militant, they're sacrificing them, of course, but what that does is turn these religious groups into NGOs almost sometimes. And there are faith-based NGOs, that's one category. But if you're engaging religion as such, you know, you can't really, you're missing the point if you think the book is, okay, here's how to instrumentalize religion and make it into an NGO. It just was not, that doesn't reveal a careful reading of the book. I remember, so two quick anecdotes, and I'll be quiet about this. Every year I go, since 9/11, I've been invited to a wonderful weekend in Warrenton, Virginia. Wonderful, not because it's some exotic island, and it's only wonderful for academics, but it's called Seminar 21, and it is run by MIT, and it's a discussion of these are 40 and 50-year-old people from the military, US military, from the intelligence operations, from some NGOs, and they are just about to move into a higher level of command in the Navy, the Army, Marines, whatever. And we have a session every October on ethnic and religious conflict. And I come on and give my spiel. I always want to talk about fundamentalism, you know, and public religion in the modern world from 1994. You've been talking about that. You know, it's wonderful, but after a while you think, can I play another one of my greatest hits besides In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida? Anyway, so I give my little spiel. Here are the ideological traits, all the cautions, here are the organizational. And then I conclude, which makes them confused. I say, now, trash all this, because generalizations are always wrong. You know, when we use these categories, they are not meant to be applied, because these movements are plastic, they're fluid, they're changing, they're adaptive. You know, you can take a snapshot and that's it. So there's no substitute for the fine-grained, dirt under your fingernails, movement by movement, place by place. That's why I was so pleased, as I know you were, when our colleague and I think your boss, or now that you're emeritus, you don't have a boss, but Sean Casey is whom I'm referring to. And when Sean took over for the State Department, that office on religion, now called religion, or what's then called Religion Global Affairs, what did he do? He actually hired experts. He actually hired 30 or more people with expertise in different parts of the world, different religions. That's what we're leading these folks to. So, and the final little anecdote that illustrates this is, you've probably been part of this too. I'll never forget, I don't know when it was some years ago, it was Fundamentalism, Ambivalence period, the overlap for those publications. And a number of us who'd written on religious violence were invited to the Defense Department for a day, fly in, fly out of DC. You've done these, you don't have to fly in and out, and there were about 8 of us, and we were led like little kittens into a room, and we were all placed at a laptop. And the idea, and we didn't know what we were doing. And they were really cool. They were pleased because they had these new technologies, laptops, and they had a screen. And we were supposed to do this exercise. They would put a question up on the board, and then, you know, under what conditions would Aum Shinrikyo emit lethal gas in the subway in Tokyo? What would the conditions be? And then there were 8 or 9 propositions, choose one, if this had happened and that happened. And we start filling this in. And then we start recognizing that these were lines from our books, that they had extracted a sentence, and we were supposed to weigh them. It was just the most bizarre, reductionistic, silly exercise. And David Rappaport, who could be a good curmudgeon when he wanted to, finally threw up his hands and walked out of the room and said, enough of this. So anyway.
Well, besides or parallel to your own scholarly work, you've played a crucial role of institutional leadership. You became very soon director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, and became an active leader and participant in Catholic peace networks, global peace network. So tell us something about this, because there is the two aspects of it. Obviously, part of the scholarly work is precisely to analyze, to clarify, to precisely to avoid simplifications and stereotypes. But other is also to allow this possibility. So tell us about this leadership on precisely the peacemaking front, let's say, especially the Catholic one.
Yeah, I'll start by making this comment. One of the rewards of going into administrative work, where you have responsibility for doing things like hiring faculty, helping with that, is that in my case, I was able to bring to Notre Dame and to Kroc, much as you folks have done at the Berkeley Center, bring people like you to Georgetown. And we've brought a number of very gifted folks that you know. I'm going to just name check one person, Atalia Omer, because Atalia, when I was talking about ambivalence, she helped me understand actually what I had written, you know, which is always gratifying when you don't realize some of
if you work on the Middle East and on Palestine, then obviously the ambivalence is very clear.
Important. Yes. So, but there are many, many others that we've brought both as faculty and as visiting fellows. And like Georgetown, what this does is it really, you can't do this work alone, and you leverage the collective in very exciting ways, and they take you into different dimensions. The Catholic Peace Building Network, which we started in 2003, did kind of flow in part out of my work on religion and working after the ambivalence book, trying to figure out, well, what does it mean? What does peace building really mean on the ground when we're working with a religious organization, in this case, the Catholic Church, which is so well suited for a global network, because the Catholic Church had this very complicated history of being called on to mediate and in other ways to engage in conflict resolution, conflict transformation. And our experience with Catholic bishops had been their attitude across the world, which is really interesting to us, was we don't know quite what we're doing in this sense. And I was naive about this. I thought, well, you're a bishop, you're following Christ, the Prince of Peace. What do you mean you don't know how to be a peacemaker? But in fact, they were not technically trained they were not ordained to do this particular profession, which has its own rubrics and concepts and principles and methods. And so we found there was a great need and hunger, not just with bishops, but with people who are already working for peace. They're just absolutely hungry for, I don't want to say what the academy could bring to them, because that sounds a little bit too exalted or too ivory tower in a way, but to enter into a dialogic process with the people on the ground in the Philippines, in Colombia, in East Africa. And we learned as much, if not more, from what they were doing. That helped us theorize, what does peace building mean? So we did a book on this. We've had a lot of, so that was a very rich, and it keeps going. We still have that project, and Georgetown is part of it, and other universities are part of it, where we're working right now on efforts on extractive industries and the justice component and the religious component of how do we push back on extractive industries that are doing so much environmental and other forms of social and economic violence in some places. So there's been a good long history of that. And I would just, right now, Jerry Powers is the person who kind of hosts that network for us, but it's located here at Notre Dame, but it's a more global network. So anyway, long story short, it's been gratifying to amplify the work and get new, rich nuances to it.
Right. So let's move now to the Contested Modernities project. Obviously, again, you mentioned already Atalia, who is one of the co-directors, and Ibrahim Musa, who also you brought you brought to Notre Dame. Tell us about the idea of the project. It took many years to frame it, to focus, but obviously where you are in the project right now. Just 10 minutes we have left before we enter to the general conversation with the audience. Just give us a framework so that people understand what the project is all about.
2 minutes or 10 minutes? I didn't hear.
10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes.
Okay. So yes, Ibrahim Musa, who holds an endowed professorship for us in Islamic thought and Muslim societies, is one of the co-directors and a leading figure for us here on the study of Islam, and Natalia Omer, who really works across the range in the study of religion, is focused on Israel-Palestine, but beyond, are the two kind of co-chairs. And Jose, you were one of the parts of that brain trust years ago, really in about the year 2000, about 10 years ago now, or around that time, when we gathered at 3 or 4 different places here at Notre Dame in DC and elsewhere to kind of brainstorm this project. So of course you were kind of an invaluable co-creator of it. And that's why whenever there's a flaw or a weakness, I blame you. I say, you know, it's Jose. That was Jose's idea.
Fully agree.
But actually, so the way the project began, it has evolved quickly. Again, it was, I think, of a piece with some of these other topics we've talked about in projects. But the idea was, how do we bring into dialogue, into collaboration, more generally, religious and secular actors whose focus is not going to be on theology or religion as such, but really whose focus is on common human challenges, like science and the human person. Reproductive technologies at the time were a big question, and 10 years ago, cloning, genetic manipulation, a variety of ethical questions. That was the one kind of topic. We also have studied the shifting patterns of identity, community, and authority in sub-Saharan Africa and in Indonesia. We've studied global cosmopolitanism and its impact upon migration and education. So the point is, the goal of the project was and remains to examine some theoretically and thematically important and publicly essential challenges, and to do so by incorporating religious voices into these questions, along with, of course, secular scientific voices. That was the idea. Now, we learned something right away, and Tom Banchoff was very much also part of especially the group on science and human person, because of Tom's own writing on bioethics. And in that group, we brought together folks like Aziz Sachedina and a variety of others, maybe a kind of a working group of 10 people who had written on bioethics, essentially, from Catholic and Islamic perspectives, and a couple of secular ethicists into a kind of core group. And then we brought in these various meetings, other religious actors and from traditions. And what we thought, again, naively, is that pretty soon we'd get right to the topic, and we'd start talking about, what do we all think about reproductive engineering or genetic engineering or cloning or whatever the issue, organ transplants even, whatever it may be. What we were surprised and kind of instructed is that it took us a while for these different interlocutors. What they wanted to talk about is the creencias, Jose Ortega y Gasset, you know, these deep convictions. What are the deep driving convictions that make one who one is? And they wanted to get into conversations about the theological anthropology or the philosophical anthropology underlying their view of the human person to begin with. We can't talk about cloning, we can't talk about these scientific questions unless we come to some kind of discourse that we can share about what is the human person. Now, this turned into, for me, a very rich conversation that lasted at least 2 or 3 years of meetings before we really got on to the specific issues. And we have a volume that should be coming out soon on all of this. Some of those contributors from the beginning were focusing on questions like, organ transplants in Egypt? What was the Islamic understanding, the state understanding of the validity of organ transplants back in 2010 and before? So there's some with very specific reproductive policies in Iran, et cetera. But then there's also in that volume, Musa contributes a very powerful essay on Islamic ethics around these topics and toward an understanding of the human person and human dignity in Islamic thought. Damien Howard has a similar essay on Catholic approaches to the human person, human dignity. He's the Jesuit in the UK who kind of is the head of the Jesuit community these days. So what you find in that volume that will be forthcoming is an interesting mix of kind of this deep sharing of these creencias and dialogue, not agreement, not consensus, but fruitful dialogue. And then the challenge becomes, okay, what then? How does this knowledge, how do these conversations become useful in a trialogue between Catholic, at that point, Catholic, Muslim, and secular? But then since then, the other thing I'll say about that project is it's expanded. Atalia in particular and Ibrahim have pushed the project beyond that original configuration of first only Catholic and Muslim primarily, so that now it's a broader range of religious traditions and much more engagement around questions of decoloniality, race, religion, and how these contested views of the modern are in the back of people's consciousness and awareness as they struggle with race questions. What kind of setting socially and technologically and epistemologically are we in today? And how do we interrogate that much more critically? So those folks have really taken the project in a very interesting, check out the Contending Modernities blog, and you'll see some of you have contributed great essays to it.
Right. Before asking you the final question, let me remind the participants you have a chance to write down your question for Scott Appleby. I see there already is a question. So please, you have the chance now while I ask Scott my final question, namely, after many years as director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, you've become the founding dean of the Keough School for Global Affairs, with a prominent focus on peace studies. So from this particular perspective, I would like you to offer your own very personal reflections, thoughts on our contemporary condition within a global pandemic and how it is affecting our notion of global affairs, and most particularly the university itself. How do you think that this pandemic is going to change the university and the way we do things?
Thank you, Jose. That's a big question, and I'll take just one take on it. So I've been privileged to be, as you said, the founding dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs. And because they chose me and they allowed me to kind of make up what we were doing, not make it up, but kind of say, the assignment was, we're going to do an international school. And you're the dean. And I said, who? I'm the dean. I turned around and looked who was behind me, who's the real candidate. But because they gave me at Notre Dame the license, so to speak, to do this, I did kind of move in the direction of religion in this sense. The mission of the school is integral human development. And I'm going to make a link to your question about how the university is changing in just a moment. And integral human development, as you know, is a concept, I think, first articulated that way in Populorum Progressio 53 years ago, Paul VI encyclical, which talked about human development, reviewing 20 years or so after World War II of the international efforts to work with the poor populations and develop them technologically and otherwise. A lot of that was benighted about that, but nonetheless, the Pope gave a critique, constructive critique, saying this is great. We're glad there's some responsibility of the wealthier nations for the poorer ones. And we welcome that. But it has to be rooted in human dignity, and it has to be rooted in a holistic view of the person. So it can't just be narrowly technical or economic. It has to be, you have to attend to the person who's a member of a family, who is a believer or a non-believer, who is a creator of culture, who is an artist, et cetera, et cetera. Wow, that is a breathtaking assignment for a school that says we are going to advance integral human development, because it means that you have to pay attention to the humanities, to the human sciences, so to speak, as well as what the Kennedy School at Harvard or MIT in a global school, quantitative and qualitative analysis of specific problems. But having that at the core of it means that we also say we're kind of this is not the best way to put a problem solving school, or we're trying to address contemporary challenges like poverty, climate change, the immiseration of more and more people, and now a pandemic. So we have a relationship to our global health unit, and we're structured around the Peace Institute, Democracy and Development Unit, a unit on human rights and civil rights, regional expertise units, institutes. And the idea is they're all kind of working together because these challenges like climate change and conflict and peace and human rights are all interconnected in governance. So we've been able to build out from that integral human development, I think, a promising future for the school, but more importantly, and to your question about the academy, even before the pandemic, my sense is the academy in this country, at least, has been under pressure of various kinds to show its relevance to these overarching problems of the world. As a historian who loves knowledge for knowledge's sake, I'm very comfortable there, but I also know that we're all called to figure out how we translate our knowledge and learning into real effective change, systemic change. And that's kind of what we're trying to do here, because that trend is not going to go away in higher ed. Whatever else we do, however the universities get reconfigured, online teaching, whatever it may be, you can be sure that we're all going to be required to pay our own way in the sense of what are you doing practically for the gaping needs that have been exacerbated by the pandemic, and how are you going to help us come out of that with real world commitment. So we're grounding that in this tradition that we hope is, as Catholic social tradition is, open to larger conversation about what does it mean to advance our common human dignity and our own development, attending to these different dimensions of human need and human aspiration. It's a breathtakingly ambitious thing, but I think not one university can do it. We all have to kind of, and we all are, I think, already trying to address this need and this requirement of universities going forward.
But I think what the global pandemic has precisely made us aware, precisely because we are now on these online global conversations. Before, we thought that we had to always be on the move. I used to be constantly traveling from one country to another country. And of course, this has its great advantage, but also disadvantages. You cannot be in 3 places the same day. Well, now you have the possibility really to constantly use these global networks that we as Catholic universities have, precisely in a much more positive way that we have used in the past. So I think that much of obviously it is restricting what we can do presentially, but it is also opening new avenues of global collaboration, global networks, to use them in a way that we have not used in the past. So at least this is a silver lining from the crisis. Let's move now to the question and answer. The first question comes from our good friend and colleague, Catherine Marshall, who writes, there is much talk today about healing, rebuilding, rethinking, especially to overcome the divides. The tumult of the COVID-19 emergency seems to open possibilities for creativity. What is your take on the deep causes of divides, starting with the US? If Guinea offers you some wishes, what would you do first come January?
If what was the first, if who offers what?
If a genie offers you some wishes,
okay. Yeah.
What would I
rub the genie's lamp?
January 1st.
I got it. Well, first of all, let me say hello to my dear friend, Catherine, who is long suffering with me because we have so much in common and I'm so elusive to get in touch with. So she's been faithful and actually, and obviously very influential, not only on me, but she has, but her work on development has been outstanding. And she'll forgive me this one little mention that I was just so gratified when the World Bank, some years ago now, I guess 5, 6 years ago, around the time of the Sustainable Development Goals renewal or whenever it was, had a conference in the World Bank on religion. And, the World Bank had ignored religion for years, except for Catherine's, constant efforts. But so here's this big conference where the head of the World Bank is convening religious actors from around the world and scholars, this big, and had an iftar dinner. And you're thinking, where have I landed? This is all incredible. And I did walk up to Catherine and I embraced her and said, look, this is your vision come to fruition. And Catherine being Catherine, she said, well, let's see what the budget looks like after this, the UN budget. And that was the right question. What do I think? It's a big question she's asking, and we all have our views on it. I think the first word is fear. That, what about the divide? Certainly in this country and around the world, I think that it's the exploitation of people's vulnerability. And because of the way capital has been centralized in the hands of few, and there's increasing inequality and all kinds of depredations that poorer people and what we used to call the middle class there's a lot of fear. And it's very interesting to me and comforting in a way that the Gospels say, fear not, fear not. Pope John Paul II, fear not, don't be afraid. That was shrewd because everyone's afraid. And then fear very quickly turns into anger, depression, and even to hate-filled dialogue. So what do we do about the fear? So if I had the genie, I very much have to say, so far Biden has been impeccable in the messages he's been sending out. And maybe it's just a contrast, but the notion of healing, of coming together, of focusing on what we have in common, which is our need and our fear, in a way, a fear that we can comfort one another with. How do we do that? How do we create structures and networks where we're very open about our fear of other races, racism, we're fear of people who might be somehow taking our own resources from us. There's so many fears. So how do we create a society in which we're open about that, and that the orientation is an awareness of that common human anxiety, and then we move that forward systematically in terms of thinking about it? So that's a big highfalutin statement, but I do like the messaging so far of President-elect Biden in terms of it's time to heal, come together. You have to start there, because in this country and in the world, we've had an avalanche for 4 years of hate-filled rhetoric that exploits fear and that separates people. These are common observations. So Catherine, I'll try to think of something more profound and let you know later.
And this brings us to the next question, related, which comes from also a very dear friend and colleague from another Catholic university, Marianne Love. With the incoming administration, what are your hopes, advice for religious engagement and religious peace building?
So Marianne, also a dear friend and colleague, I don't say this flippantly at all. I'm quite serious. First thing comes to mind and listening to that question is, I hope that you are part of the administration. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. I do think, I don't want to be naive or Pollyanna-ish, but one hopes, and those of you at Georgetown will know the details more than I do, but what I've also heard recently about how this administration is putting priorities together, I think there is a window to revive the engagement with religion in a positive, constructive way. Who knows what that will take? But John Kerry's in the administration. Biden himself is thinking alongside, and like what Obama's presidency, which was much more open to taking religion seriously in a positive way. And Marianne is the type of person, if you don't know her work, who is positioned as one of the experts who can help guide the administration in thinking cleverly and creatively about religious engagement, religious peace building. There are dozens of others. We did a task force. There were a couple of task forces some of us participate in on engaging religions globally. And that had some momentum that I think led in part to Sean's office being established. Some of those reports, not only the ones we worked on, we would hope that would be renewed and that this will be taken seriously. And I think we have friends in the new administration that a Marianne Cusimano Love should be really in the center of that conversation.
Well, thank you. While somebody else writes a new question, let me ask a question about what can we Catholic universities do on all these issues much more working together? Obviously, we are competitors with one another, but we are also working together and we could do much more together. I mean, I'm looking now at precisely, and we do on a personal level, obviously we work with Catholic University, American Catholic University, we work with Notre Dame, but I always have the feeling that a global network of Catholic universities could do much more because there is no other network of universities like the Global Catholic Network. And so the question is, how can we put this network to a better use, both nationally at home and globally abroad?
Jose, thank you for that question. I'm going to be very straightforward and blunt in answering. We Catholic institutions, I would include Notre Dame at the top of the list. Georgetown would be in that list. We are second to none sometimes in being arrogant. And you mentioned competition, and it's, you know, we can't answer Catherine's question about how do we reconcile the society or address healing and fear if we don't stop being a little childish. I'll put myself in the boat in this sense. Boston College, Georgetown, Santa Clara, Notre Dame, many other Catholic colleges, universities. Those are some of the bigger ones I mentioned. But the competition notion, I think, is archaic now. We can't be having. Yet we're all competitive. We wouldn't be doing what we're doing if we weren't inherently competitive. I understand that, but we got to put that aside. You know, we all, Notre Dame recently has had its fair share of humbling moments, and that's probably a good thing for us. So the first point I make is, among the Catholic universities, just in this country, especially the universities with so many resources like we have, we've got to, we really do have to be in partnership, real, sincere, not worrying about who's ahead or behind kind of partnerships. So that, because I think the talent that we have in these universities is awesome, and we don't draw on it collectively to leverage our Catholic voice. Part of that is because we're all busy as hell. You know, that's a common excuse. It's real. I know the folks who are your colleagues. I know people here, and we're chasing our own tails. So we got to find a way around that and figure out a way that we collaborate together, because we have different things to offer to the conversation, different areas of expertise, but all within a kind of shared Catholic ethos, small c, big C, that the world really needs. And there have been some terrific things, and the Berkeley Center has pioneered several of them, of getting that Catholic voice out there, and Catherine, some of her projects. So anyway, you're touching a nerve here for all of us, not just me. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa for whatever I or my colleagues might have done to say, let's put up the walls and the drawbridge and come into our palace only at our invitation. We got to do away with that. And I think we can't do anything else until we honestly address that competitive barrier to us, especially the ones with the most resources, beginning to think, how can we better apply those resources to the collaborative effort we all need?
Well, thank you. And let's have now the final question come from Fritz Heinzen. It's a very, very large question. With so many challenges, climate, human rights, food insecurity, isolationist movements, etc., how do you get traction with rulers, their administrators, and their societies, which are increasingly fragmented and disconnected by social media, disinformation, propaganda, etc.? And then the final negative or fearful question: will entropy overwhelm your noble task?
You've been somehow, who asked the question, Jose?
Fritz Heinzen.
Oh, Fritz Heinzen. you know, Fritz, how have you had access to my nightmares and dreams these many days when you ask these questions? How did you know that's what I'm worried about? Um, you know, we can't sugarcoat it, and we can't be naive about the challenges. And on the other hand, I try to resist the understandable apocalyptic scenarios that people are building in the pandemic. The challenges are they're enormous. I don't think they're insurmountable. And again, I don't want to make too much of Biden's rhetoric, but I do resonate with the very simple, unadorned message that we can do this. We can yes, we can still halt, if not fully reverse, the climate disaster we're all facing. Can we do better on resolving conflicts and adjusting to mass waves of migration and refugees that are coming next and that have been coming already? It's going to require enormous compassion, and that's where overcoming the fear is part of it, and taking risk. And I think a practical thing, if there's a way you can think of any of us where you reach out, can have a connection with an individual who's in power. If you had where, you know, you get through the fog of the social media and all that, and whenever there's a chance for even a brief one-on-one conversation in trust with people who control resources, have power, political and others, that often is one of the more effective ways of advancing a conversation, by trying to have a kind of personal, individualistic conversation with people. That's not always easier or possible, but that there's no substitute for a kind of human one-on-one interaction in which you can talk directly without artifice about the challenges we face and the fears. So again, I'll think of a better answer for next time.
Maybe let's just as a final comment. There is a question coming from Subandri Simbolon from Indonesia, and it's about how this Pope Francis Fratelli Tutti is related to all this talk we've been having today.
You know, I think in general, Pope Francis is the prophet that we needed, who's been sent to us on these issues, beginning with Laudato Si, through Fratelli Tutti. And I think in general, I don't want to say his message is the same it's not, there are nuances, but there is a coherent body of thought there that he represents, that it is about solidarity, ultimately, I think. And Fratelli Tutti is all about solidarity. What does it really mean? All the things we've been talking about, these big questions, how do we heal? How do we come together? You know, this is a deep reflection on what it means that we are one people with one God, and we are in deep solidarity, not just as a slogan, but as a practice. And so reflection on solidarity coupled with Laudato Si's framing the whole question around our common home and our environment is, I think, a remarkably wise and welcome prophecy from our Pope. So the more we can discuss and reflect upon those documents he's produced, and he's taking every opportunity, God bless him, as you know, to get the message out. He's talking to NBA players. He's talking to a range of auditors. He's an open, wonderful interlocutor and guide. So Fratelli Tutti deserves a Jose Casanova 90 minutes to itself.
Indeed, and I hope we'll dedicate as much time as necessary because to all those encyclicals. Scott Appleby, thank you so much for the conversation, for your enlightening thoughts, for your reflections and your life work and how it is related to everything which is so important for all of us, for our schools, our universities, and for global humanity. Thank you, all of you, all the participants, all the attendants, and again, we will see you again. I don't have the date here, but sometime in mid-January, we'll continue our conversation with Robert Hefner from Boston University, expert on Islam, and we'll continue this conversation. As we indicated, it has been video recorded and will be available on YouTube early next week on the website, and you'll find a link in your email. So thank you, Scott, once again. Thank you all. See you next time.